Optimize your nutrition this year with Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal service. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are dietitian approved, ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from 40 weekly options across 8 dietary preferences, like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Eat smarter at factormeals.com/listen50 and use code LISTEN50 for 50% off, plus free shipping on your first box. Factormeals.com/listen50, code LISTEN50. Get this, adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Wondery. greenlight.com/Wondery.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you're a returning listener, I want to say a big thank you for your continued support. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, welcome. It's great to have you on board. So without further ado, let's get started on today's story. Hey everyone, and welcome to this extra episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. I'll be answering some of the questions I get asked regularly through emails and DMs, things like how I choose the cases, how I research them, and what goes on behind the scenes putting the podcast together. I thought it was a good time maybe to sit down and go through a few of them properly with you, especially as the show is continuing to grow and more of you are reaching out to me with great questions, I have to say, and messages of support, which I'm very thankful for. The next full episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries, your usual episode, will be out as normal this Sunday. But for now, I hope you enjoy this special Q&A. Right, let's crack on with it. I just picked some questions at random, some ones that I think you might be interested in. Well, you obviously are. Some people are interested in them as they're asking the questions. But so look, number 1. How do I decide which cases to cover on Ireland Crimes and Mysteries? So basically, I suppose, what could I say about that? Choosing which cases that I cover, I suppose, is honestly one of the most important and sometimes one of the hardest parts of the whole process. I always start by asking myself a few questions, like, is there a strong story here? Are there layers to the story? Is there a sense of injustice, maybe, controversy, things like that, that would really kind of pull the listeners in? I'd be drawn to cases that aren't just about the crime itself, but also about the ripple effect, I suppose. How a whole community might have been impacted, how justice was or wasn't served, and I suppose how the story has evolved over time. Having said all that, I do like to strike a balance between cases that are well known and ones that maybe haven't got the attention that they really deserve in the broader media sense. So it's important to me then on Ireland Crimes and Mysteries that I don't just recycle the same handful of famous cases that everyone's already covered. Obviously, every case is important and every story is important, but I like to try and cover both, between the ones that are famous and the ones that aren't. I want to shine light on those stories as well that have been overlooked or even forgotten. I suppose instinct plays a big role in it. Sometimes I'll be researching something completely different and I might stumble across a little paragraph about a case I'd never even heard of before, and it just kind of draws me in, And when that happens, when I can't kind of stop thinking about it then because I'm like, how did I never hear about this case before? Then that's when I know I have to look into it deeper and that there's probably a story here that I might have to tell. At the end of the day, my goal is really to respect the real people at the heart of these cases while trying to, in tandem, create an experience for you, the listener, where you feel completely pulled into the story as well. I want every episode to feel immersive, like you're right there with me while I'm telling the story. So that's kind of a lot of elements go into picking the story. So the next question I got from a listener was, do you ever get feedback from families or people involved in the cases that you feature? And the answer is yes, I do. I actually have got feedback from a good few of the cases I've covered, and thankfully it's been overwhelmingly positive. which obviously means a huge lot to me because that's very important, when you're telling these true crime stories, especially ones that involve real people, real pain, real loss. So you have to be mindful of the fact that there's living, breathing families behind these cases. And that's something that I do take very seriously. So yeah, over time, families have connected with me and reached out to me after I've covered their loved ones and to thank me basically for covering the case. And sometimes they even share little extra stories with me, personal stories to them that I wouldn't be sharing them on the podcast, their personal stories, unless they specifically ask me to. Those moments are actually incredibly humbling, I suppose you could say, because, when you hear back from a person closely connected to the person you were talking about, yeah, it makes it really real. That's kind of it, I suppose, really, for that question. Getting that kind of feedback does reassure you that you're approaching the work the right way, with the respect and dignity and all that it deserves. And it also motivates you. So, yeah. So number 3 then. Which episode so far has been the hardest for you to research or record emotionally? Ooh, that's a tough one. Because quite a few of the cases have stayed with me long after I finished recording the episode. But if I had to pick, I couldn't even pick a particular episode. I'd say it's always the ones involving children or completely innocent victims, really, that kind of hit you the hardest. Those stories are heartbreaking to research because you're not just reading, news reports, you're diving into these children's lives that are gone. It's one thing, I suppose, to read about a crime from a distance, but when you start getting into the personal details, what someone was like, what their dreams were, the family behind the person, it all becomes very real. And you can't help but feel a deep sense of sadness and anger at the injustice of it all, really. There have been times, especially when I'm researching children's cases, that I've had to kind of step away from the research for a few hours or even a couple of days just to kind of process what I'm reading, especially cases where there's a lot of violence, violence that seems so senseless, or where the loss has rippled out and devastated kind of whole communities, not just the family. So those kind of cases, yeah, they can take it out of you. They're emotionally draining, obviously, and they're also the ones that feel most important to tell properly. You really want to make sure you tell their story properly. So when I sit down to record after spending so much time with these stories, I always try and make sure that the humanity of the victim does come true, that they're remembered as more than just a crime that took their lives. That's a responsibility that I take very seriously, I have to say. So the next question then, has covering sensitive cases ever made you rethink how you approach storytelling on a podcast? Wow, that's a very well thought out question. But I suppose the answer would, yeah, absolutely, it has. When I started doing Ireland Crimes and Mysteries, like a lot of people, I was drawn to true crime. I was fascinated by what happened, why it happened, and how all the pieces would fit together. And I was focused on covering the story beneath the headlines, kind of like trying to piece through timelines, motives, investigations. And that's still important, of course. But the longer I've been doing this, the more I've realised the real heart of these cases isn't just the events, it's the people affected by them. Over time, I've become much more conscious of how I tell these stories. I think carefully about the language I use, how much graphic detail is truly necessary, and whether the way I present a case honours the victim rather than turning them into just a part of the narrative. So there's a huge difference between telling a powerful story and sensationalising tragedy. And I always want to stay firmly on the right side of that line, to be honest. The more I've worked on the podcast, the more I feel a responsibility to make sure that behind every event, every investigation, there's a human being who has to be remembered properly. It's made me so much more mindful, not just about what I say, but how I say it. So, at the end of the day, I believe listeners connect far more deeply when you can hear the humanity in the story, not just facts, being thrown at you. And that's the kind of storytelling that I want Ireland Crimes and Mysteries to be known for. So yeah, the next question. Are there any cases you really want to cover but haven't yet for some reason? Well, yeah, there's lots of cases. and there's definitely a few that I've had my eye on for a long time but haven't covered yet. Sometimes it's a matter of timing, from the point of view that the case might be still quite recent and raw for the family. Not that it ever isn't raw, but really raw, I mean. And, I don't want to go launching into a podcast about it if it's just in the very recent past. Or else there could be something like ongoing legal proceedings that would make it tricky to kind of cover responsibly. So I'm very conscious that just because something's technically in the public domain doesn't mean it's the right time to kind of put a microphone in front of it. Other times then, it's about the amount of research a case deserves. Some stories are so layered, they've so many twists and are so emotionally charged that they need more time to tell properly. And I obviously don't want to be rushing those. So if I feel like a case needs extra care to build out all the important details, then I'd rather hold off and come back to it when I can give it the proper care and attention that it really deserves. And even if that means putting it aside for a while until the timing feels right, then that's what I'll do. Then there's also cases that feel personally kind of heavy, I suppose, stories where the pain is still so close to the surface for the families involved. And I think it's important to have a bit of distance with those cases too, out of respect for people still living with all the trauma in the aftermath of these cases. So yeah, there's definitely episodes I'm holding in my back pocket, waiting for the right moment to tell them properly, I suppose. And when I do, I want to make sure they're handled with the kind of depth and respect that Ireland Crimes and Mysteries listeners expect, and that I expect as well to give. So next question, how long does it usually take you to research and put together one episode? Right, that depends on the case. There's no two episodes that are ever the same when it comes to the amount of work involved. For some, they're more straightforward cases where there's a lot of information available and everything lines up cleanly, and I might be able to put it together in about a week. But even then, that's a week of full days researching, cross-checking facts, structuring the episodes, recording and editing. And then for deeper, more complex cases, it can easily stretch into several weeks. Some cases involve a huge amount of digging through old newspaper archives, books, interviews, and sometimes even reaching out to people connected to the story. It's not just about gathering information either. It's about sorting through it all, figuring out what's credible, what's relevant, how to tell the story in a way that feels clear, respectful, and engaging. And then there's the writing side of it. I don't just want to be listing off a load of facts. I try to build a picture for the listeners, create a real sense, I suppose, of time and place, and make sure the human side of the story is at the front and centre of the story. And that takes time to get it right. So the short answer, I suppose, is some episodes come together fairly quickly. Others are a long labour of love. But I never rush an episode just to get something out. I'd rather take the extra time to make sure that every story I tell lives up to the standards that you'd expect from Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. So next question, where do you find the most reliable information about older Irish crimes? That's a good question. And I suppose the answer is really finding reliable information on older Irish crimes can definitely be a challenge, But it's one of the parts, I suppose, I genuinely enjoy. It's kind of like a bit of detective work in itself. I rely heavily on newspaper archives, especially older local papers, and there's good websites online that have all the old archived Irish newspapers. So I'd be trawling through them, and they're a brilliant source because they often capture details that national outlets, especially the local newspapers, that national outlets either missed or only mentioned briefly. Local journalists can be much closer to the community and, they can pick up on the mood of the town or the village at the time, not just on the facts of the case. I'd also then obviously read books written by journalists and historians if it's a really old case. And they can be a huge help, especially ones that focus on that particular case or a specific time period. I do always try and make a point of cross-referencing those though, because, no matter how well written a book is, It's still one person's interpretation of the events. I also look at interviews, documentaries, and sometimes old archived radio shows, anything that can offer extra angles. Sometimes it can be just some throwaway comment in an old interview that leads to a whole new avenue of that story. Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of digging that goes on, and it can take time to separate the fact from the rumour, but that's all part of what I enjoy doing. I want to make sure that I tell the story as accurately as I can, especially older stories, so that you're not just kind of retelling the same old headlines that were there before. So yeah, a lot of work can go into it, but it's worth it. It's worth it, if you get the story together, and especially older ones. It's worth it when you can put it all together and get out the podcast. Next question then. Have you ever uncovered something during your research that surprised you or changed your view of a case? That's another good question. They're all very good questions now, I have to say. And I suppose the answer to that would be yeah, I have. Quite a few times, not a lot of times, but yeah, a few times. Sometimes when you start on a case, you think you have a rough idea of what happened because you've seen the headlines or watched the documentaries. But sometimes once you really start to dig into it, you find there's often a lot more to the victim's story than ever made it into the public arena. That's the part that can really hit you, learning about who they were beyond just what happened to them, their life, their family, their dreams. You really start to get a vision for what the person was like. They become real. But that can be heartbreaking sometimes to see how the media coverage over the years has reduced them to just a name in a crime story. And there's so much more than that. So I always try and keep my focus on the victim, as you know, not the person who caused the harm. Obviously, the perpetrator is part of the story, of course, but they're never the centre of it for me. It's the victim's voice, their story. That's what matters the most to me. And doing this research, it often reminds me why that approach is so important, because if you don't tell their full story, they can risk being forgotten for all the wrong reasons. Next question then. Do you work alone on all your episodes, or do you have a team helping with research? God, I wish I did. Yeah, no, I do all of it myself. The research, the writing, the recording, everything. And honestly, at the moment, that's kind of how I want it. Because when I'm working on a case, it's not just about pulling all the facts together. It's about getting close, as I said there before, to the victim's story, understanding who they are, what they loved, and what was lost. That's not something I would ever want to hand over to somebody else. I feel kind of responsible to do that work myself from start to finish, to make sure that the story is told with the respect and humanity that it deserves. Now, that being said, working alone can definitely be stressful at times, because I'm not just producing the episodes, I'm also managing the schedules, the research timelines, the recording deadlines, everything. I'm always working against the clock to make sure each episode is ready for release when it's meant to go out. So yeah, I try to stay a few episodes ahead whenever I can. But life can be unpredictable, whether it's personal things popping up or just natural delays that come from having to do a lot of research. And I never want to be in a position where I'm kind of scrambling and trying to put together something that doesn't meet the standard that you'd expect. So being ahead on my podcasts, being a few podcasts ahead, gives me a bit of breathing space, and it helps to kind of protect the quality of the show, I suppose, without putting myself under unnecessary pressure. At the end of the day, Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is very personal to me. It's my baby. It's not just content, it's stories that deserve to be handled carefully. Next question. What first got you interested in true crime and mysteries? It's not that there was one big moment where I suddenly got interested, I suppose. It's just something that's always kind of been there. I've always kind of had an interest. I've always been drawn to real stories. I love reading biographies about people and that. Yeah, and especially, I suppose, real stories that don't have a clean ending, tied up in a nice little bow. But what really, I suppose, pushed me towards true crime was how often I saw the victims getting lost in the headlines. Everything would be about the perpetrator, their background, their court appearances, their life story, while the person who lost everything, lost their lives, would barely get a mention. And that's always kind of annoyed me, to be honest. So that's the main reason I started Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I wanted to tell the victim story, to put them back at the centre where they belong. I wanted listeners to know who they were, not just what happened to them. And keeping awareness out there also of missing people has become a big part of the show. Sometimes cases slip out of the news, but the families are still living with the loss of their loved one who's still missing every day of their lives. So I don't ever want those stories to be forgotten. So by putting them in the podcast, hopefully they're there for forevermore. Next question. How do you mentally decompress after spending hours reading all about crime cases? So yeah, you just kind of have to learn to compartmentalize. I can never say that word, compartmentalize things. And when I'm working, I'm obviously fully focused on the story. But once I'm finished for the day, I do try and switch off. You have to really, or you'll end up carrying it around with you all the time. And obviously that's not very healthy. So as I said, when I'm not working, I do things that are completely different. I spend time with my family, my friends, go out in the fresh air, go for walks, listen to music, anything that has nothing to do with crime or any of those kind of heavy subjects. You need time away from it all. So yeah, it's about keeping a balance, I suppose, really. You can't be living in that kind of dark headspace all the time or it will wear you down. So you have to learn, as I said, to compartmentalise. I make a conscious effort to step away when the work is done and to focus on something good, the ordinary things in life. And that kind of resets you then for the next day, the next podcast. Next question. What's one Irish location you visited or want to visit because of a case you covered? Right, there's a few places that stand out that I want to visit, but West Cork, I have visited, definitely. That's the one that comes to mind, especially Skull. It's such a beautiful part of the country. But when you know kind of what happened to Sophie Toscan du Plantier there, you can't help but wonder how somewhere so peaceful and stunning could be associated with something so awful. Do you know, I think being able to visit a place connected to a case can give you a better sense of the atmosphere. You notice things you wouldn't pick up when you're just reading about the case. In the case of Sophie, then you realise how isolated it feels, how quiet it can be, even the way the weather can change. Those small things, they tell you a lot about what it might have been like at the time. So, like, even if I'm not physically visiting every location for every case, which I'm not, obviously, I'd be travelling the length and breadth of the country and I'd never get any of my writing or research done. But I always do try and get a real understanding of the setting because, you know, it helps me to tell the story, I suppose, a bit better, to describe it in a way that feels real for the listeners. Places do hold memories. You can feel it, you know, sometimes when you're there. If you weren't podcasting about crime, what other genre would you like to do? So if I wasn't doing true crime, I'd definitely be doing something about Irish history or Irish folklore. You know, I always loved that side of things. Ever since I was very young, really. I used to love listening to the old stories my grandmother would tell. She'd talk about the banshee, fairies, all that kind of stuff, pushogues, all the old beliefs that were just part of everyday life for their generations and going back. And it wasn't entertainment to them, it was part of how they understood the world around them. There was a real respect and sometimes fear, for things that they couldn't really fully explain. I do think a lot of that side of Ireland is kind of been lost now. People today, people move fast these days, modern life, everything's about modern life, and those old stories are part of where we came from. They say a lot about the way people lived, the struggles they faced, the way they tried to make sense of things they couldn't control. So yeah, if I ever stepped out of true crime, I think I'd love to dig into that world properly. Not just the well-known myths and stories, but lesser-known ones. Maybe even mix it in with travelling around Ireland, visiting old places tied to legends and sharing the history behind them. It's something that, I've always been interested in. That sense, kind of that even the smallest village or the quietest hill that you pass could have a story attached to it. You could just know how to look for it. Yeah, I always find that kind of stuff interesting. So the next question, are you planning to branch into video? YouTube or live shows in the future? Yes, I suppose. Yeah, I do plan to do that in the future. It is definitely in the plan. It's definitely something I'd like to do. Maybe showing locations connected to cases, behind the scene work, or doing live talks eventually. But right now, my focus is on building the podcast properly. I want Ireland Crimes and Mysteries to be as strong as it can be before adding anything kind of new like that. Getting the foundations right is more important to me than rushing into the video side of things just because it's what everyone else is doing. So when the time comes and the time is right that I can afford maybe even to take on extra help, like someone that could help with editing video or managing the extra workload, then that's definitely something that I'd start moving into, that side of things. It's definitely on the cards, but right now I have so much, because I'm on my own, it's a big workload for one person. So adding video and editing video to it would be, I think, a bridge too far right now. But, we'll just keep building the podcast, growing the audience and making sure the stories stay at the same level that you all expect. And when I do expand, I want to do it properly, not just in half measures. So yeah, it's definitely in the future. So watch this space. Will you ever cover crimes outside of Ireland? Yeah, it's not something I'm planning to do kind of straight away. But I mean, obviously, if it's something the listeners wanted me to do, I'd be open to thinking about it. But the heart of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is obviously Irish crime, and that's what the podcast was built around. And that's where my focus will always be. But if there is strong interest in hearing about international cases, especially ones maybe that have an Irish connection, I'd definitely consider doing the occasional special episode. The main thing for me is making sure that whatever story that I tell fits the tone of the podcast. Real cases, treated properly with the same respect and care. So, yeah, if listeners want it, I'd be open to it. But Ireland will always be the home of the podcast, I suppose, is what I'd like to say. Right. And so one last question. So would you ever consider doing an episode where you revisit solved cases and see what happened since? Yes, definitely. But only if something major happens in the case, obviously. If there's a big development, like new evidence coming to light, or someone has been charged, or a conviction maybe overturned, or even a major breakthrough in one of the missing persons cases, then yeah, I would definitely go back and do a follow-up episode. For me, it's not about rehashing old story just to fill a space. There would have to be something important, obviously, something that genuinely changes the story or adds a new layer to it. So I think if you're going to revisit a case, it should be because there's real news or real progress, not just because time has passed. At its core, Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is about telling the full, proper stories from the start. But the truth is, some cases don't really end, do they? Even after a trial is over, lives go on, questions linger, new information can come to the surface. So yeah, if something significant happens, something that matters to the victim's story or to the search for justice for that person, I would absolutely go back and cover it properly. I think it's important to stay with the story when it's justified to do so, obviously. So guys, that's it for the extra episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Thanks so much for listening and for sending in the questions. It was great to be able to take a little time out and share a bit more about the work that goes into the podcast behind the scenes. So if you have enjoyed this Q&A, or if you'd like me to do more of them every so often, let me know. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, or just search Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. And don't forget to check out my website at irelandcrimesandmysteries.ie. That's where you'll find more about the show, and I do blogs there and updates and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, and I mean, if you'd like even more bonus episodes or more direct access to me, you can join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/Ireland Crimes and Mysteries, with the Ireland, the crimes and the mysteries word, those three words with capitals. So patreon.com/Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Every little contribution there really helps with growing the show and keeping it moving forward. And it's a great way for me to connect more closely with the people that support the podcast. So yeah. So the next full episode of the podcast will be out at the usual time this Sunday, so make sure you're following Ireland Crimes and Mysteries wherever you listen. And until then, keep your eyes open and your mind curious. Talk to you then, guys. Thanks a lot. So guys, that's it for today's episode of the Ireland Crimes and Mysteries podcast. Again, thanks for your listenership, and don't forget to subscribe to the show and hit that auto download so you never miss an episode. Until the next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious. This podcast has been compiled from information gathered in the public sphere, like news articles, documentaries, and open source material that can be found on the web. Everything in this podcast is alleged unless a conviction has taken place.